To most users, the freedom to pack up and move your digital assets and identity does not matter, but it might matter one day, and when it does, it will matter a lot. Hello and welcome to another episode of Ethereum Audible, Ethereum in depth, where we read the best in the web3 ecosystem. I hope this is a happy Tuesday for you and that the week has started out great. Today we will be reading the third, and I think for now at least the last, in a series on why web3 matters, what's all the fuss about, and what web3 actually is. Definitions are pretty hard in this space because it's fluid and moving all the time. But we started off with DHH and Punk6529's takes on why crypto matters, or in DHH's words, I was wrong, we need crypto. And last week we read through Moxie's breaking down of decentralization in Web3. Is it decentralized or not? What are the APIs in the entire ecosystem that are causing centralization and concern? Today we're going to be reading Dror Poleg, Unpacking the Web3 Sausage. Dror Poleg is kind of a thought leader, thinker in the Web3 space, and he put out a good response to Moxie when Moxie's piece came out that I wanted to read through. And we'll wrap up kind of me sharing my own thoughts on how I define Web3 and what matters in Web3. And then I think the next few weeks we're going to be focusing back in on proof of stake, the end game for Ethereum, because the merge is right around the corner. If you haven't been keeping track of that, well, it's something you should have on your radar, because it looks like in the next 3 months, the merge is going to happen. And that means that beyond going from proof of work to proof of stake, I mean, for the bag holders out there, what that means is that basically we're going to be cutting the ETH issuance down by around 90% when you consider EIP 1559 and the burn that's going on and the reduced emissions that proof of stake has versus proof of work mining, and reduce the supply by something by 90%. And I'm stuttering because I'm excited, and the demand is only increasing. Well, 1 + 1 = 5 in this case. So I think this is something you definitely have to have on your radar. But naturally, here at Ethereum Audible, we're going to be taking a little bit more of the kind of in-depth, maybe academic point of view, and we're going to be exploring the possible weaknesses that proof of stake might have and answers to those weaknesses, and why the Ethereum ecosystem really believes so strongly in proof of stake. But first, we're going to be reading Unpacking the Web3 Sausage by Dror Poleg. And as always, before we start, I want to give a huge shout out to Alpe Audio. For those of you who don't know, Alpe Audio is your hub, your location, your app for learning topics, courses, in depth, on the go. If you ever listen to a podcast like this and don't remember what you learned at the end of it, have no fear. Alpe Audio's got you covered. They send you a summary of what you learned once you finish listening. There are flashcards, there are resources so you can dive in further. Every episode and lesson is broken down into chapters so that you can more easily navigate what you're listening to. And it's not a arbitrary podcast where I get to decide what thing and what topic I go in each episode. No, Alpe Audio is actual audio courses structured in a way that you remember them and can learn on the go in depth. So huge shout out to Alpe Audio for helping with Ethereum Audible. And with that, let's go. Dror Poleg, Unpacking the Web3 Sausage. Crypto is interesting for the freedom it enables, not for the freedom users currently care about. A response to Moxie. This is from January 9th, 2022. Portable sausages. Quote, Jews, Germans, and oil are best export commodities. End quote. The dictator Nicolae Ceausescu boasted in the 1970s. He was talking about my grandmother, my father, and my uncle. Some people loved living in the Socialist Republic of Romania. My grandmother didn't. After surviving Auschwitz, she wanted to give her children something better than communism and anti-Semitism. But she couldn't just pack up and leave. Someone had to buy her. From 1945 onwards, Romania collected more than $100 million in cash and other commodities in exchange for Jews. as Zaratar recounts in The Great Departure. Quote, "The exchange of Romanian Jews for money and agricultural products had begun covertly after the Second World War. A Jewish businessman in London named Henry Jacober served as the middleman between private individuals in the West and the Romanian Secret Service. Jacober traded briefcases full of cash, typically $4,000 to $6,000 per immigrant, depending on the individual's age and educational status, for exit permits to the West. When Israeli intelligence officials got wind of the deals, they decided to get in on the scheme. With the approval of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, at Khrushchev's insistence, the Romanians began to demand agricultural products instead of cash. Soon, Romanian Jews were traded for everything from cattle and pigs to chicken farms and cornflake factories. The price of exit could go up to $50,000, depending on the migrant's age, education, profession, family status, and political importance." End quote. In 1962, my grandmother, father, and uncle managed to get their exit visas and boarded a plane to Rome. They were only allowed to take their clothes, bed linen, and food for the trip. Everything else, property, appliances, jewelry, books, even photos, had to stay in Romania. To kickstart the family's fortunes in the New World, my father and uncle took a few Hungarian sausages with them. They heard a rumor that Italians paid generously for such rare delicacies. But the rumor was wrong, and after running around the streets of Napoli for a few days in search of generous customers, my father and uncle threw the sausages away and boarded a boat to Israel. Being able to pack up your stuff and leave is not something that matters to most people most of the time, but when it does, it matters a lot. A recent discussion on the promises and limitations of crypto or Web3 made me think of those Hungarian sausages. Our current dilemmas seem farcical in light of historical tragedies, but they might ultimately matter a lot. In 2022, the world's brightest minds are arguing about digital tokens, JPEGs of monkeys, and Super Bowl ads. Last week, the Financial Times recently quoted me in a takedown of a shoddy ad starring Matt Damon, and The Guardian ran a piece on why NFTs of Bored Apes are actually worthless. A more substantial contribution to the debate about the future of the internet came from Moxie Marlinspike, founder of Signal, a private messaging app. Moxie shared his first impressions of Web3 in a blog post. He was not impressed. But before we get to his points, let's clarify what we and Moxie mean by Web3. Web3 in a nutshell. Web3 is used to describe a new approach to how the internet should run. In our current era, Web 2 or Web 2.0, a handful of giant companies own most of the data and govern most of communication and transactions. This creates two main problems. 1. Users cannot easily leave a platform they don't like because all their data, relationships, and digital assets are not portable. 2. This also works in reverse. Users can lose their data, relationship, and digital assets overnight when a platform like Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube decides to shut down their accounts. And even in the best of times, users are not compensated for the value they contribute to the platforms they use. For example, Facebook makes billions off of people posting content for free and clicking on ads, but Facebook users don't get compensated for their contribution. In other words, the web we have is too centralized, leaving too much power and profits at the hands of a handful of giant companies. Web3 is an umbrella term for various efforts to reshape the web and address these issues. Specifically, these efforts include developing decentralized computing infrastructure that is difficult to censor or shut down, and developing protocols that allow users to easily port their accounts, as in their identity, their data, or their digital assets, across different apps. Decentralized bottlenecks. The vision for Web3 is admirable, but Moxie set out to understand how the decentralized sausage is made in practice. He was not impressed. Moxie's first concern was that Web3 is not as decentralized as it claims. In this case, access to the basic infrastructure of Web3, which is the Ethereum blockchain, ends up being routed through a couple of popular API providers. So even though the blockchain itself is decentralized, most apps that depend on it still go through bottlenecks that are centralized and operated by private, for-profit entities. To use an analogy, consider a person who buys a piece of gold and stores it in a keyed vault under a mountain maintained by a Swiss bank. When the person logs into the bank's app to check his gold balance, the app doesn't send a person into the vault to check how much gold is there, or whether someone's tampered with the vault's key. Instead, it shows data from a third-party database that records the inflow and outflow of gold bars from the whole mountain. so the customer gets the latest information, but it does not get direct, indisputably true information. The imaginary bank does this because it's much easier to maintain a central database of all deposits and remittances from the mountain rather than send someone in person each time a client logs into the app. Ethereum-based apps use API providers for the same reason. It's easier and simpler for them to do so rather than verify every query on the blockchain itself. This choice of expedience over decentralization is bad in some use cases and harmless in others. The issue Moxie raised is known, and Ethereum developers have spoken and written about them publicly and are working on ways to mitigate them. And I've also written about how each wave of decentralization creates a concurrent wave of centralization. Still, Moxie missed or failed to mention an essential difference between those issues and what's currently happening in Web 2. We'll get to that in a minute, but first let's look at Moxie's second concern: good for no things. After trying to build a decentralized app and encountering centralized APIs, Moxie created an NFT and listed it on OpenSea, the most popular NFT marketplace. For those of you not familiar with the term, an NFT is a digital token used to track the ownership of a specific thing. NFTs are most commonly used to sell and trade digital art. A creator can upload an artwork, which is an image, video, song, or text, to a marketplace like OpenSea, and her fans or speculators can buy a token that confers ownership and usage rights of said artwork. The buyers can then use the token to sell their rights to other people. NFTs are a key example of Web3's promise to liberate users from powerful platforms. Even though NFTs can be created and listed on platforms like OpenSea, they are not stored on these platforms. When you create or buy an NFT, that action is recorded on the blockchain itself. This means that you can buy an NFT on one platform and then take it with you to a different platform or sell it to someone else without anyone else's permission. You can use a crypto wallet like MetaMask or Rainbow to access all your funds and assets on the blockchain without having to log in to any specific platform. This might sound like nonsense. Why would anyone want to buy and sell tokens that confer ownership of digital goods? But when you consider the fact that humans spent more than $60 billion on in-game purchases in 2021, or $13 billion on digital music streaming, or $22 billion on digital artworks, you begin to see the value of a digitally native ownership system. In Web 2.0, you can buy a movie on Amazon Prime or a song on Apple Music, but you lose access to these assets if you decide to leave the platform or get kicked off. The goal of NFTs is to enable users to own their stuff outright, take it with them, and shift power away from platforms and corporations. But this was not Moxie's experience. Who moved my JPEG? Moxie created an NFT on OpenSea. He intentionally programmed the listing to look different on different platforms by loading a different image depending on the IP of the requesting site. Initially, he could see the NFT in his crypto wallet, which meant his ownership of it was documented on the Ethereum blockchain. However, a few days later, OpenSea decided to remove his NFT from their marketplace, claiming Moxie violated their terms of service due to the code that changes what users see. Technically, the fact that OpenSea decided to remove the NFT from their marketplace should not matter. Moxie still owned it, and this ownership was recorded independently of OpenSea, on the blockchain itself. But when Moxie checked his crypto wallet app, he noticed the NFT had disappeared. How could this be? Moxie dug deeper and found out that the wallet app he was using, MetaMask, did not really show what was in his account on the Ethereum blockchain. Instead, his wallet app relied on an API, the OpenSea API, to check which NFTs were associated with which blockchain account. And since Moxie's NFT was removed from OpenSea, the API showed it no longer existed. This felt like Web 2 all over again. A powerful platform managed to confiscate or delete a user's data and assets from his account without his consent. But there's an essential distinction between what happened to Moxie and what happens when a Web 2.0 platform decides to delete a user's file or listing. The invisible sausage. Moxie dove into how Web3 apps interact with one another and discovered a few key limitations. The most alarming of them was the disappearance of his hard-earned digital goods from his crypto wallet. But even though Moxie's NFT did not appear in his wallet app, it still existed, and Moxie was still its owner. The failure to see the NFT was a problem with the wallet's app architecture and the API it relied on. the wallet app relied on an API instead of verifying information directly on the blockchain. And the API provider did not include NFTs that were not listed on OpenSea. If Moxie had used a different app that checks the status of his NFT directly on the blockchain, he could have seen that the NFT is still there. Indeed, you can see that NFT on Rarible, an OpenSea competitor. To return to our early analogy, the gold bar is still inside the vault, inside the mountain, even though the bank's app doesn't show it. Of course, the fact that the popular wallet apps don't display stuff in people's accounts, even though that stuff is still there, is a problem. But the good news is that even though OpenSea removed Moxie's NFT, that NFT survived and remains in his possession. I'm also pretty sure he'll end up making a lot of money when someone buys it as a souvenir of the whole ordeal. I already put a bid. Epilogue. Unlike my dad, if I ever need to move, I can take most of my assets and cash-generating businesses with me. If America decided to kick me out or sell me back to Romania, I can continue to make money as long as I have access to my Twitter, Gmail, Maven, and Stripe accounts. The biggest threat to my livelihood is not losing citizenship, it's losing access to my accounts on multiple platforms. Crypto and Web3 promise to increase my freedom to switch between the platforms I rely on and my likelihood to survive a hostile action by one of them. This promise is only partly fulfilled at this point, and it might never materialize in full. Unlike some, I do not believe that Web3 will be more just or equitable or even more free by default, but I do believe it offers the possibility of increasing our freedom and agency. And in light of general and personal history, this possibility is enough to pique my curiosity and garner my support. To most users, the freedom to pack up and move your digital assets and identity does not matter, but it might matter one day, and when it does, it will matter a lot. There's plenty of work to do. It's great to have you on board, Moxie. Okay, and that was Dror Poleg on Unpacking the Web3 Sausage. His piece really rings true for me, and maybe it's because our family backgrounds are very similar. My grandparents are also all Holocaust survivors, and the last statement that he closes this article off with, which I'll just repeat, is just so true in my mind. Quote, "To most users, the freedom to pack up and move your digital assets and identity does not matter, but it might matter one day, and when it does, it will matter a lot." End quote. I think in the West today, we are most users. The freedom to pack up and move your digital assets or your assets in general, it's not something we think about. We think we'll always be able to move money from our bank accounts or, get cash out of the ATM. But the reality is that things change on a dime. And this happened in my family history to people I know, all of my grandparents. I met them, I spoke with them. They're no longer with us, but this is something that I know to be true. And it's not in some ancient history, and it's not in third world countries. No, this was in Germany and Poland and France and, Europe, right? Today, Western Europe, that we consider these things would never happen. And so even if you are in the West and this doesn't seem like something that's relevant and applicable in our daily lives, the truth is, when it matters, it really matters. And that's not to forget the entire rest of the world, where property rights are not such a strongly defended aspect of people's everyday lives. And so the ability to pick up with your digital assets and just have a key that you remember 12, 24 words, whatever it is amazing. And you can show up in a new country and still have your assets on chain. No one can confiscate them from you. You can leave without hiding jewelry in different places of your body and whatever it is, and show up and not be destitute and not be a burden on whatever country is bringing you in. And that freedom to opt out of the system, whether you're kicked out or you're fleeing, is incredibly powerful. And that's something that only Web3 brings. And just on that alone, I think it justifies it. But I do want to add on, my own definition of Web3, which is slightly more encompassing and not only about fleeing from war. And in my opinion, I could define Web3 as this. Web3 is digital ownership that's orchestrated by trust through open protocols, tokenization, and decentralization. And another way, if you want to think about it, is it's property rights. that are brought digital property rights that are facilitated by open protocols, tokenization, and decentralization. And I'm going to break each one of those down because it comes down to three things. There's trust for builders and operators. There's aligning incentives between builders, users, and the entire protocol. And that happens through tokenization. And the last piece is there's decentralization. And each one of those layers are built upon each other, because for trust to occur, for anyone who's building an app or for users, you need to have open and transparent infrastructure that you can judge and see. Today in Web 2, there is limited amount of trust for builders that they can interoperate with each other, APIs, but you never know when a centralized platform will change that API or deprecate it, and your entire business will just go out of business. And we've seen this happen over the past decade a lot with Facebook and Google. And so the ability to be able to build on top of something that's open, that's transparent, that you have trust that it will be around and it's worth your time to build on, that enables a lot of innovation. And that is a key tenet of Web3. That is built on aligning incentives. And aligning incentives is not only between developers and companies or corporations, it's also between users and developers. And that happens through tokenization. But it's more than just aligning incentives, because tokenization gives us liquidity for everything. And the ability to have liquidity for everything solves a lot of problems that we have around Web 2. Everyone loves to talk about how Facebook generates billions of dollars off of the back of our data and our content and things like that, and we don't make any money off of it. The reality is, it's really hard for Facebook to judge and know which user is worth which amount of money, because each individual's user's data is worth nothing. We're only worth a lot to Facebook on an aggregate data, after they've put a lot of work into making sense of that data and giving it meaning for advertisers. But it would be nice if they could pay us back. And I think the problem with that is that there's no quote-unquote liquidity in that market. There's no way for Facebook to really trade and incentivize us based on how much we're worth, because there is no liquid market. The same is true for people's time, people's attention, and that's something that can be solved with tokenization, where you can, given a liquid market for time, for attention, for effort, for data, you can build incentives into the system that pay people out. And by giving a token that trades freely on the market vis-a-vis other currencies, other assets, you can have price discovery. And so there could be price discovery for what your data is on Facebook. This is what Balaji Srinivasan calls the DeFi matrix, and I think this is going to blow our minds over the next few years. We're already seeing this play out in play-to-earn games, where in Axie Infinity, what's being tokenized is really the arbitrage in people's time and effort between third world countries and first world countries, where they want to buy smooth love potions or Axies, and what's being traded is time, and it's being given liquidity through tokenization. But for tokenization to work and through tokenization, incentive aligning, you need to have decentralization, because the liquidity only occurs on open platforms like Uniswap. And Uniswap is only decentralized because it's an open protocol running on Ethereum, a decentralized blockchain. And why you need decentralization is because a lot of these things are securities. A lot of these things are not, perfectly legal. They definitely don't fit inside any real regulatory framework, even if they are legal. And what gives them value is the ability to trade versus every other asset. You can swap in and out of, Axie's tokens and trade into USDC, which can be traded into dollars, which, Visa and MasterCard are putting on their network. That's what gives these things value. It's that they are interoperable with what actually matters to a lot more people in the real world. If you want to think about how this plays out in Web 2, there are a lot of these quote-unquote currencies today. airplane miles, Starbucks rewards. If you use Duolingo, you get lingots. Every system has karma points and tokens, but they don't have real value because you can't trade them for real money or for anything else you actually care about. They're stuck in a closed system. And just by value of them being stuck in that closed system degrades their value immensely. And to be able to trade openly on something like Uniswap or SushiSwap or whatever it is, Thorchain, that's what gives them the value. That's what enables the tokenization and the aligning of incentives. Because without that, they're not worth anything. And that can only be built on decentralized blockchains. Because decentralization is the ultimate arbiter of trust. It means that it can't be stopped. It can't be changed. It's immutable. And that's why decentralization has to be part of the Web3 definition, in my opinion. And it doesn't show up in everyone's opinion. Packy McCormick gives a different one in his piece, which is, quote, Web3 is the internet owned by the builders and users, orchestrated with tokens, end quote. And he goes on to say that he intentionally doesn't use the word decentralization but I here completely disagree. And I think decentralization it has to be part of how we define it. Because without decentralization, applications like Uniswap can't exist, or whatever they'll be in the future. Without the ability to swap in and out of tokens freely, without barriers to entry, without gatekeepers and centralization in that angle, we won't be able to align incentives. And without aligning incentives, without that tokenization, there's no liquidity. There's no liquidity. That means you don't know if there's trust in the protocols that you've built. A lot of protocols in Web3 are not decentralized, but they have incentive alignment between builders and users and different nodes on the network. But that's an alignment of incentives and trust that comes from that. It comes from having liquidity. And without that decentralization, there's nothing there. And that's why I think the definition that I've come to is really, it's property rights brought digital, and it's facilitated by open protocols, tokenization, and decentralization. And we think about property rights and digital ownership. That's what a lot of tokens and crypto brings us. Bitcoin is property rights around money, gold, a place in the ultimate ledger on property. Ethereum is property rights around, the digital oil, being able to transact and operate with all of those Web3 decentralized applications out there. And if you're an ultrasound money believer, then it's also ultrasound money. Art-focused NFTs are digital rights around art. Game-focused NFTs are digital ownership around games, and that those characters are yours, and you can bring them, move them, and sell them without the game owner deciding anything. And that's why decentralization has to be there. That's why it's around property rights and digital ownership. Now, in terms of decentralization, I don't mean to say that every app has to be maximally decentralized, and I don't even mean to say that the entire ecosystem has to be maximally decentralized. The fact that most apps use Infura and OpenSea and those APIs is a problem, but it doesn't make the entire system collapse. No, decentralization is a spectrum. And what decentralization gives us is it gives us the ability to choose what ecosystem will be in, whether that's a country and a nationality, whether you're going from Romania to the United States or getting kicked out of Ukraine, or what bank you want to use, what social network you want to be on. Decentralization gives us choice. It gives us the ability to migrate from one platform to another. And that choice is what Web3 can bring us. Something that we don't have all the time in Web 2. We only have it based on competition, which is great, but sometimes competition isn't quite there, especially in aggregator-driven digital economies. And that ability to just get up and leave is incredibly powerful. And I touched on this last week when I was commenting on Moxie's take, even if most of the ecosystem uses centralized databases or centralized APIs, the ability that they have to be aware that as a user, you can just spin up your own node and you can ditch them and leave them and not lose anything as a user. That's a very powerful competitive dynamic. And that same competitive dynamic exists in a lot of protocols that are built on Ethereum, right? What is SushiSwap? SushiSwap is people who decided we don't like what Uniswap is doing and we'll just exit. We'll take what we've learned and we'll go fork it and do our own thing. And that ability makes Uniswap that much better. And that ability makes the banks and the wallets and everyone else who will come on board that much better, because they'll know that users can do that. And even if 99% of users don't do it because they don't want to run their own servers, and I agree that most users don't want to run their own servers, that's what matters. It's the choice to pick up and leave. It's the freedom to transact, and that at its core is the promise that Web3 gives us. But on top of that, we have all these aspects that are, I'll call them more fun, more nice to have and not must have. And that is property rights brought digital, orchestrated by tokenization, open protocols built on decentralization.